Did you think today's fashion was weird? Ever wondered what people wore 500 years ago that made them look cool? The Renaissance period might seem fancy and sophisticated in your history books, but trust me, it had some seriously questionable style choices that would make your jaw drop faster than dropping your phone in the toilet. Number 12, Codpieces, the original look at me accessory. Have you ever padded your bra or stuffed socks down your pants? Well, Renaissance men took that idea to a whole new level. Codpieces were basically decorative pouches worn over the crotch area of men's tights or breeches. But these weren't subtle little additions. Oh no, they started small in the early 1400s as practical coverings for the opening in men's pants, which were actually separate legs tied together at the waist. Weird, right? But by the mid-16th century, they had transformed into enormous, padded, decorated statements that screamed L-O-K-A-T-N-Y-J-U-N. King Henry VIII of England was particularly fond of these masculine jinkes, sporting increasingly large and elaborate codpieces that were sometimes decorated with ribbons, slashed designs, and even jewels. Talk about bling in uncomfortable places. Some codpieces were so massive they could have doubled as small purses. In fact, men sometimes used them to store small items like coins, handkerchiefs, or snacks. Imagine reaching down to your crotch at a formal Renaissance party to offer someone a mint. The codpiece wasn't just about vanity. It had political implications too. The size and decoration signaled status, wealth, and suggested virility. Portraits of powerful men often emphasized their codpieces as symbols of masculine power. Doctors even recommended them as protection for the delicate male areas during sword fights and horseback riding. Makes sense. But did they need to be shaped like seashells or animal faces? Because yes, that happened. By the end of the 16th century, this fashion trend finally deflated. Pun absolutely intended. Fashion shifted to looser garments, and men everywhere probably breathed a sigh of relief. Modern historians debate whether the exaggerated codpiece was a serious fashion statement or if Renaissance folks were in on the joke. Either way, it remains one of history's most eye-catching and giggle-inducing fashion accessories. Number 11, ruffs, the neck prisons. Ever felt strangled by a tight collar? Renaissance nobles voluntarily strapped what looked like giant white donuts around their necks. Ruffs started as small frilled edges on shirt collars in the mid-16th century, but by the 1580s they had exploded into massive circular confections of starched linen that could extend up to a foot from the neck in all directions. These neck contraptions required serious upkeep. They were made from yards of expensive fabric, meticulously pleated and set with hot pokers called setting sticks. Special starch, made from wheat or corn, was imported at great cost to create the perfect stiffness. Some ruffs were so enormous they required a wire framework called a supportus to hold them up. Just imagine trying to eat soup without dipping your giant neck plate into it. Queen Elizabeth. I loved ruffs so much, she was rarely seen without one. In fact, her ruffs became so massive that courtiers had to use extra-long spoons to avoid stabbing her in the eye when serving her food. Talk about workplace hazards. The bigger and more elaborate your ruff, the more wealthy and powerful you appeared. Some had multiple layers, gold or silver threads, lace edges, or even colored with saffron, an insanely expensive spice. Spanish and Dutch nobility took ruffs to the extreme, with some reaching nearly 2 feet in diameter. These fashion victims couldn't turn their heads without rotating their entire bodies. Doorways became a navigation challenge. Whispering in someone's ear was impossible, and heaven forbid you need to scratch your neck. The ruff effectively created a permanent personal space bubble around the wearer, perhaps history's first social distancing tool. The church eventually spoke out against ruffs, calling them the devil's work and symbols of sinful vanity. Some regions even passed laws limiting their size. By the 1630s, they were replaced by the falling band collar, which was basically a flat collar that draped over the shoulders. Necks across Europe finally knew freedom again. Number 10. Chopines, the death-defying platform shoes. Think modern platform shoes are extreme. Renaissance Venetian women teetered around on shoes so tall they needed servants just to walk. Chopines were platform shoes that could reach heights of up to 30 inches. That's 2.5 feet. Originally designed to keep women's expensive dresses from dragging in the muddy streets of Venice, they quickly became status symbols. The higher your chopines, the wealthier and more important you were. Walking in these ankle breakers was such a challenge that noble women required 1 or 2 servants to support them on each side. Imagine calling your friends, "Hey, want to go shopping? Great. Bring your human crutches." These monstrosities were usually made of cork or wood, covered with leather, brocade, or velvet, and sometimes decorated with cutout patterns or gems for that extra flash while face planting. Foreign visitors to Venice were both fascinated and horrified by chopines. One ambassador described Venetian women as looking like giants when dressed and dwarfs when undressed. The shoes were so tall that women's dresses had to be made significantly longer, using extra fabric, another way to flaunt wealth since silk and brocade were extremely expensive. Chopines weren't just uncomfortable fashion statements, they were also tools of social control. Some historians believe that husbands encouraged the trend because it literally made it impossible for their wives to go anywhere unaccompanied. Talk about a mobility restriction. The difficulty in walking also created a distinctive swaying gait that was considered extremely attractive at the time. Pain was definitely gain in Renaissance beauty standards. Despite their impracticality, chopines remained popular for over 2 centuries, spreading from Venice to Spain and other parts of Europe. The trend finally began to decline in the 17th century, when slightly more reasonable heeled shoes came into fashion. Modern podiatrists would probably have a field day studying the foot deformities these fashion victims must have endured. Number 9. Slashing. Renaissance peak abou fashion. Have you ever bought pre-ripped jeans? Renaissance nobles took that concept to ridiculous extremes. Slashing was the bizarre practice of cutting deliberate slits into perfectly good clothing to reveal the fabric underneath. This wasn't just a rip or two. We're talking dozens or even hundreds of small cuts arranged in elaborate patterns across sleeves, bodices, and pants. The trend supposedly began after the Swiss defeated the Burgundians in the 1477 Battle of Nancy. The victorious but badly dressed Swiss soldiers apparently took the fancy garments from dead Burgundian soldiers and wore them over their own clothes. When their old clothes poked through tears in the looted garments, a fashion trend was born. Talk about battlefield chic. Slashing quickly became insanely elaborate. Craftsmen developed specialized tools just for creating perfect, decorative cuts. The slashes revealed contrasting fabrics underneath, often brightly colored silks that peeked through more somber outer garments. The most extreme examples featured thousands of tiny cuts that transformed sleeves into what looked like fluffy pom-poms of fabric. This style was especially popular among German mercenary soldiers called Landsknechts, who took slashing to ridiculous extremes. Their outfits featured massively ballooning, slashed sleeves and pants, so covered in cuts they resembled shredded wheat. They were essentially walking textile explosions. These soldiers were so dedicated to their slashed fashions that they were even exempted from sumptuary laws, which limited extravagant clothing because the authorities figured they might as well look good before dying in battle. The wealthy elite didn't just slash their clothes, they also slashed their shoes, hats, and purses. Some nobility would commission clothing with specific patterns of slashes that became almost like a personal brand. The trend reached its peak in the mid-16th century when slashing became so excessive that some garments had more gaps than actual fabric. The irony of this fashion trend is mind-boggling. Fabric was incredibly expensive during the Renaissance, yet people deliberately cut it up for style points. It would be like buying a Lamborghini today and then taking a sledgehammer to it to show everyone you could afford the damage. The trend finally faded in the early 17th century, when apparently someone realized cutting up perfectly good clothes might be a little silly. Number 8. Bombasting. The original body, padding. Ever wished you could instantly gain muscle without hitting the gym? Renaissance. Men created the original muscle suit by stuffing their clothing with everything from cotton to sawdust. Bombasting, yes, that's where we get the word bombastic, involved padding clothing to create exaggerated body shapes that were completely anatomically impossible. Men's doublets, tight-fitting jackets, were padded at the chest and shoulders to create a broad-shouldered, barrel-chested silhouette that tapered to a narrow waist, essentially the Renaissance version of a superhero physique. The most extreme examples created a silhouette where the wearer looked like they had a shelf you could set a drink on protruding from their chest. The stuffing materials ranged from the luxurious to the ridiculous. Wealthy nobles might use cotton or wool, while those with smaller budgets turned to horsehair, bran, or even rags. Some particularly desperate fashion victims reportedly used sawdust or dried peas. Imagine the sound effects of someone walking around with pants full of dried peas. This was especially problematic if they got caught in the rain. Nothing says wardrobe malfunction like soggy, expanding padding. The fashion reached its most extreme in the 1570s, 1580s, with the peascod belly, a doublet front padded to create a rounded protrusion over the stomach, supposedly resembling a pea pod. This bizarre aesthetic essentially gave men a fake pot belly that extended over the top of their pants. Today, we spend millions on diet plans to avoid looking like this. But Renaissance men literally stuffed their clothes to achieve the look. Bombasting wasn't just for men. Women padded their sleeves to ridiculous proportions, creating so-called melon sleeves that could extend wider than their bodies. Upper-class women also wore heavily ballooned bodices and padded bum rolls, or French farthingales, crescent-shaped pads tied around the waist to make their hips appear wider and their skirts stand out more dramatically. The extreme padding created all kinds of practical problems. Wearers couldn't get through narrow doorways. Sitting was a challenge, and raising one's arms was sometimes impossible. The heavy padding also made these clothes unbearably hot. Renaissance nobles essentially walked around in insulated clothing during summer with no air conditioning. Not to mention, the organic stuffing materials attracted insects and rodents. Imagine discovering a mouse had taken up residence in your padded shoulder. By the early 17th century, fashions shifted toward more natural silhouettes, and people gradually stopped walking around looking like they were wearing football gear under their clothes. Modern phone shoulder pads from the 1980s have nothing on the Renaissance originals. Number 7 farthingales. The original social distancing tool. Think modern hoop skirts are big. Renaissance women wore cages around their waists that made doorways their sworn enemies. The farthingale was essentially an undergarment made of hoops of wood, whalebone, or steel that created a cone or bell-shaped silhouette for women's skirts. They first appeared in Spain in the mid-15th century and quickly spread throughout European courts. The earliest Spanish farthingales created a cone shape from waist to floor, making women look like walking triangles. Not to be outdone, the French developed their own version in the 1580s. The French farthingale or wheel farthingale, which extended the skirts horizontally from the waist, like a shelf before dropping to the floor. When viewed from above, women wearing these looked like walking tape. By the late 16th century, some farthingales reached over 3 feet in diameter. Women wearing them had to turn sideways, or sometimes even backwards, to fit through doorways. Sitting posed a unique challenge. Special wide chairs without arms had to be developed, or women would perch on the edge of stools, their skirts rising up comically in front of them, like a drawbridge. Court dances had to be modified because women couldn't get within 3 feet of each other or their partners. Imagine a ballroom full of women trying to dance while maintaining a 6-foot diameter of personal space. Carriages had to be redesigned, with wider doors and special seating arrangements. Some women reportedly got stuck in doorways or tipped over because of the unwieldy weight distribution. The amount of fabric required for covering these massive structures was staggering. A single court dress could use up to 15 yards of expensive silk or velvet. The skirts were so wide that women often stored things on the flat shelf created by wheel farthingales, like a convenient portable table. There are accounts of court ladies carrying small dogs, fans, or even refreshments on their hip shelves. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect was their flammability. With women unable to see what was happening at ground level and their massive skirts constantly brushing past candles and fireplaces, accidents were common. Several court ladies reportedly burned to death when their farthingales caught fire and they couldn't escape the burning cage fast enough. Queen Elizabeth, I was particularly fond of farthingales and helped popularize the most extreme versions. Court painters struggled with how to represent these bizarre silhouettes in portraits, sometimes showing the queen as if floating on a cloud of fabric. The style finally began to decline in the 1620s, when narrower silhouettes came into fashion and women could finally fit through doorways again without turning sideways. Number 6. Fontange. The Tower of Hair. Fought big hair died with the 1980s. Renaissance and Baroque women built scaffolding on their heads that made them duck through doors. The fontange, named after one of Louis XIV's mistresses, was a towering headdress that combined the woman's natural hair with wire frames, padding false hair, ribbons, and lace to create a front-rising vertical arrangement that could reach up to 2 feet in height. Legend has it that the trend began when the Duchess of Fontange lost her hat while hunting with King Louis XIV. She hastily tied up her hair with a ribbon, and the king found the look so charming that it became the must-have style at court. Like many fashion trends, it quickly spiraled out of control. What started as a simple ribbon-tied hairdo evolved into an architectural marvel that required engineering skills to construct. The most extreme versions had multiple tiers arranged in receding layers that Dontley-lists called étages, literally floors-like in a building. These hair towers were often themed with decorations representing current events, personal interests, or political allegiances. Some women wore miniature gardens, complete with birds, flower arrangements, feathers, or fruit. Others displayed tiny ships to commemorate naval victories or miniature scenes with figurines. Imagine walking around with an entire diorama on your head. Maintaining these structures was a nightmare. The hair was coated with pomade and dusted with powder to help it hold shape. Since washing would destroy hours of work, many fontanges remained in place for weeks or months. Women slept in special chairs with neck supports, rather than lying down to preserve their hairstalls. The lack of washing, combined with heavy pomades, created the perfect environment for lice and other pests. Some accounts mention mice making nests in particularly neglected fontanges. The weight could cause serious neck pain, and the structures were highly flammable, especially dangerous in rooms lit by candles. There are reports of women's hair catching fire at court functions, causing panic as the flames spread from one elaborate hairstyle to another. Art! Bout a bad hair. The fontange reached its most extreme form in the 1690s, before suddenly collapsing, pun intended, from fashion when Louis XIV reportedly told women at court he preferred simpler styles. Within months, the towering hairpieces disappeared almost entirely. Perhaps the women were secretly relieved to be free of their neck-straining hair architecture. Number 5. Flebozo sleeves, the wingspan fashion. Ever gotten your sleeves wet while washing your hands? Renaissance nobles had sleeves so enormous they could soak up an entire sink. Flebozo sleeves, sometimes called hanging or trumpet sleeves, were massively oversized sleeves that hung down from the elbow or shoulder, sometimes reaching all the way to the floor or extending several feet to each side. These weren't just slightly oversized sleeves. We're talking about fabric appendages that could contain more material than the entire rest of the garment. Some extended up to 6 feet in length and 4 feet in width at their openings. The name flebozo comes from their resemblance to bloodletting tools, which tells you something about how bizarre they looked. The sleeves created all kinds of practical problems. They dragged on the ground, collecting dirt, dipped into food during meals, caught on furniture, and made any kind of manual work impossible. Women with these sleeves needed servants just to help them navigate everyday activities without destroying their surroundings. Imagine trying to eat soup with fabric wings that could potentially wipe out everything on the table with one wrong move. The ridiculous size served an important status function. Only someone who didn't need to work could possibly wear such impractical clothing. The enormous amount of expensive fabric required also signaled wealth. Some noble houses nearly bankrupted themselves trying to keep up with sleeve inflation as the fashion grew more extreme throughout the 16th century. The most elaborate flebozo sleeves featured slashing, embroidery, gems, or fur lining, making them even heavier and more expensive. They were detachable from the main garment and were sometimes passed down as valuable heirlooms. That's right. Family sleeve inheritance was actually a thing. By the early 17th century, the trend began to deflate as more moderate sleeve styles came into fashion. Furniture makers and dinner hosts everywhere probably breathed a collective sigh of relief as the wingspan of the average dinner guest returned to reasonable proportions. Number 4. Corsets. The organ rearrangement tools. Think modern chapad is uncomfortable. Renaissance women wore torso cages that literally rearranged their internal organs. While corsets existed in various forms throughout history, they reached new extremes during the Renaissance and Baroque periods. The ideal silhouette required a perfectly conical torso, with the bust flattened and raised and the waist compressed to sometimes impossibly small dimensions. The most extreme corsets were made with busk's rigid strips of wood, whalebone, or metal inserted down the front. Some were so stiff that women couldn't bend at the waist at all. They essentially turned the upper body into a rigid cone. The pressure could be so intense that it caused shortness of breath, indigestion, constipation, and even displacement of internal organs. Medical texts from the period describe women's livers and stomachs, being found in abnormal positions during autopsies. Young girls were placed in corsets as early as age 2 or 3 to train their growing bodies into the desired shape. By adolescence, many noble women's ribcages were permanently deformed from years of constant compression. The ideal waist measurement was around 13 to 15 inches, physically impossible for most adult women without serious organ displacement and rib removal, which wasn't a surgical option then. The process of getting into a corset was a 2-person job at minimum. Servants would place the corset around the woman's torso and then use a stick to twist the laces tighter and tighter, like ratcheting a tourniquet. Women would hold onto bedposts while servants braced their feet against the bed frame to gain enough leverage for proper tightening. Morning dressing routines could take over an hour just for the corseting process. Fainting was so common among tightly laced women that special smelling salts and fainting couches became standard equipment in ladies' rooms. Some women had their lower ribs surgically removed to achieve smaller waist measurements, all without anesthesia or antibiotics. The most devoted followers of fashion reportedly had special notches cut in their dining tables to accommodate their compressed waists while allowing room for their pushed-up busts. Despite causing numerous health problems, including digestive issues, breathing difficulties, muscle atrophy, and even miscarriages, corsets remained essential garments for fashionable women for centuries. The torture devices finally began to loosen, literally, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when women's rights movements and changing fashion ideals allowed for more natural body shapes. Number 3. Fake beauty marks. Renaissance acne chic. Ever tried to hide a pimple? Renaissance nobles put fake ones on their faces as status symbols. Artificial beauty marks, or patches, mouches in French, were small pieces of black silk, velvet, or taffeta cut into shapes and stuck to the face with adhesive. While they initially may have been used to cover smallpox scars or blemishes, they quickly became elaborate fashion statements. These weren't just random spots. By the 17th century, the placement of patches had developed into a complex language. A patch near the corner of the eye indicated passion. One by the lip suggested flirtatiousness, while one near the right cheek declared you were married. A patch on the left cheek, that meant you were engaged. It was essentially Facebook relationship status for your face. The shapes grew increasingly elaborate. Simple circles and squares evolved into stars, moons, hearts, diamonds, and even tiny silhouettes of animals or people. Some courtiers wore patches shaped like horse-drawn carriages or sailing ships. Elizabeth I's courtiers sometimes wore patches shaped like the royal coat of arms as a sign of loyalty. Talk about facial patriotism. During politically divided times, beauty marks became political statements. During the English Civil War, royalist women wore patches on the right side of their faces, while parliamentary supporters wore them on the left. Your beauty mark placement could literally get you accused of treason. The most extreme beauty mark enthusiasts wore dozens of patches at once, turning their faces into constellation maps. Some 18th century portraits show women with up to 30 patches of different shapes scattered across their faces. Since the patches were often made of black material to contrast with the fashionable white face powder, the effect was rather like walking around with a face full of flies or moles. Men weren't immune to the trend either. Fashionable gentlemen wore patches, particularly those shaped like crescent moons or stars near their temples or on their cheeks. King Louis XV of France was rarely seen without at least one perfectly placed mouche. The beauty mask madness reached its peak in the 18th century when specially designed patch boxes became essential accessories for the elite. These tiny containers held different shapes and sizes of patches, along with adhesive. Women would reapply their beauty marks throughout the day, sometimes changing the placement to signal mood changes or intentions toward different admirers. The trend finally faded in the late 18th century when the French Revolution made such aristocratic frivolities dangerous to display. Looking too fancy could literally get your head chopped off, patches and all. Number 2. Lead face powder. The toxics beauty standard. Think modern makeup can be harmful. Renaissance women literally painted their faces with poison. The most coveted complexion during the Renaissance was a ghostly white pallor that showed you never had to work outdoors. To achieve this deathly pallor, women, and many men, coated their faces, necks, and décolletage with ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. This toxic paste was applied thickly to the skin, creating a mask-like appearance that covered all natural skin tone. The lead slowly poisoned users, causing hair loss, muscle paralysis, and eventually death. The irony: as the poisoning progressed, it actually made the skin gray and sallow, requiring even more white lead to cover the symptoms caused by the white lead. It was a vicious, deadly beauty cycle. Queen Elizabeth I was perhaps history's most famous lead makeup addict. Her iconic white-faced portraits show the mask of youth she carefully maintained into old age. By her later years, she had lost most of her hair and had significant facial scarring from smallpox and lead poisoning, all hidden under inches of toxic makeup. The application process was elaborate and dangerous. Women would first apply layers of egg whites or a mixture of borax and vitriol to prepare the skin, both caustic in their own right. Then the lead paste would be applied with specialized tools or brushes. Once dry, it created a smooth porcelain-like finish that cracked when the wearer smiled or frowned, much like modern theatrical makeup. To complete the look of living death, women would trace their veins with blue pencil to appear more translucent, use belladonna drops, another poison, to dilate their pupils for a dreamy expression, and apply vermilion, mercury sulfide, yes, more poison, to their lips and cheeks for a splash of color. The makeup couldn't be easily removed, so it often stayed on for days or weeks, with new layers applied over the old. This led to skin infections, inflammation, and accelerated the absorption of toxins. Some women reportedly died with up to half an inch of accumulated makeup on their faces. Despite widely known side effects, including tremors, muscle weakness, insomnia, depression, and even madness, the fashion persisted for centuries. Some historians believe the makeup may have contributed to the early deaths of several prominent figures, including Queen Elizabeth herself. The toxic white face trend finally began to fade in the late 18th century when less lethal alternatives like zinc oxide became available. By the Victorian era, a more natural look became fashionable, though their version of natural still involved quite a bit of powder just without the lead. Number 1. Fashionable consumption. When tuberculosis was... Could you imagine pretending to have a deadly disease to look trendy? Renaissance and Romantic era. Europeans actually tried to look like they had tuberculosis. While this wasn't a clothing trend per se, it was perhaps the most bizarre beauty standard in Western history, the glorification of illness as fashion. During the late Renaissance and into the Romantic period, tuberculosis, then called consumption, was bizarrely romanticized. The disease causes extreme thinness, pale skin with flushed cheeks, bright eyes, and an ethereal, weak appearance, qualities that became associated with spiritual beauty, artistic sensitivity, and aristocratic delicacy. Women, and some men who weren't actually dying of TB, went to extraordinary lengths to appear consumptive. They drank vinegar and lemon juice to induce digestive problems and create an appropriately gaunt appearance. Some ate small amounts of waxy material to achieve the ghostly pallor of the disease. Others applied makeup to create dark circles under their eyes and artificial spots of high color on their otherwise pale cheeks. Tight corseting was employed to make the chest appear hollow and the collarbones more prominent. Key signs of advanced tuberculosis. Some women deliberately cultivated a persistent cough and spoke in breathy whispers to mimic the vocal weakness of TB patients. The consumptive look became so desirable that people would compliment women by telling them they looked perpetually on the verge of death. Fashion reinforced this macabre aesthetic, with dresses designed to accentuate frailty-drop shoulders to make the neck appear longer and thinner, bodices cut to emphasize protruding collarbones, and pale colors to enhance the ghostly appearance. Fainting couches became essential furniture pieces as women regularly collapsed from a combination of tight corseting and deliberate malnourishment. Literature and opera glorified the beautiful deaths of consumptive heroines like Mimi in La Bohème, contributing to the romanticization of a disease that was actually a painful, debilitating way to die. Poets wrote odes to the spiritual beauty of consumptive women, with their translucent skin and ethereal detachment from worldly matters. In reality, tuberculosis causes suffocation, wasting, bloody coughing fits, and extreme pain. This morbid fashion lasted well into the 19th century, only beginning to fade when germ theory emerged and people finally understood that tuberculosis was contagious, not romantic. The tubercular aesthetic remains one of history's strangest beauty standards, deliberately mimicking the symptoms of a deadly disease that was killing millions of people. Ever wondered why we judge other eras for their weird fashion when we might be doing equally bizarre things today? What fashion trends from our time will people 500 years from now be laughing about?